A winter's reflection. Margaret Lancaster sat in her favorite armchair by the bay window, a steaming cup of chamomile tea resting on the side table beside her. Outside, the street was blanketed in a thick layer of fresh snow, the kind that muffled sound and made the world feel quiet, almost peaceful. The street lamps cast a golden glow over the untouched drifts, and the whole neighborhood seemed still, except for one figure moving steadily through the cold. Walter Lancaster, her husband of 60 years, was outside again. Shovel in hand, he carefully cleared a path through the snow in front of their house. Margaret watched, feeling a familiar warmth as she observed his routine movements, the way he dug the shovel in, lifted the snow, and tossed it aside with practiced efficiency. Walter had always been strong, even in his early 80s, and despite her concerns about his aging knees, he refused to let the winter storms get the best of him. She expected him to finish their walkway and come inside for his usual cup of coffee, but instead, he did something that made Margaret pause. He didn't stop at their property line. He crossed the street. Straight toward Alice Meyer's house. Margaret set her teacup down with a soft clink against the porcelain saucer. Her fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of her shawl. It wasn't the first time she had noticed Walter doing this. In fact, it had become a pattern. Every time it snowed, Walter made sure Alice's driveway and sidewalk were as clear as their own, sometimes even more so. He had done this last winter, too, and Margaret had written it off as an act of neighborly kindness. But something about this year felt different. Margaret's sharp, observant eyes followed his every move. Walter wasn't just shoveling Alice's sidewalk, he was being meticulous. He took his time, scraping down to the pavement, making sure there wasn't a single slippery patch left behind. He even sprinkled salt across the walkway, something he sometimes forgot to do for their own steps. Why? Alice had only moved into the neighborhood a couple of years ago, and though she had always been polite, she and Margaret had never developed much of a friendship. A widow in her late 50s, Alice mostly kept to herself, only exchanging brief pleasantries when they crossed paths at the mailbox or grocery store. Margaret had always known Walter to be a helpful man. He had spent decades as a school principal, the kind of leader who stayed late to help struggling students and attended every community event. He was the type of person who shoveled for elderly neighbors and fixed broken fences without being asked. But Alice wasn't elderly. She wasn't sick, as far as Margaret knew. And she had lived here long enough to hire a snowplow service, like many others on their street. So why was Walter so determined to help her? Margaret's heart clenched slightly as a new thought took root. Could there be something more? At first, she dismissed it. The very idea was absurd. Walter was her husband. They had been together for over 6 decades, had raised children, endured hardships, and built a life side by side. He had always been devoted to her. Faithful. Loving. But as she watched Walter linger in Alice's driveway, chatting with her at the front door for far longer than necessary, doubt crept in. Was this just kindness? Or was it something else? Margaret pressed her lips into a thin line. She wasn't a woman prone to jealousy. She had never needed to be. But she knew something was different this time, and she wasn't going to ignore it. That night, as Walter came back inside, shaking the cold from his coat and stamping the snow from his boots, Margaret was already seated at the kitchen table, waiting for him. "You sure have been spending a lot of time helping Alice," she said, keeping her tone light as she poured him a cup of coffee. Walter glanced up, slightly startled, then shrugged as he reached for the mug. "She's alone, Maggie. And winter's tough." Margaret studied him, searching his expression for something. Guilt? Nervousness? But Walter simply took a sip of his coffee and rubbed his hands together for warmth. "Winter's tough for a lot of people," she said evenly. "But you don't shovel for the Petersons or the Greens. Just Alice." Walter hesitated for a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible moment of pause. Then he smiled, that same warm, familiar smile that had reassured her for years. "She doesn't have anyone to help her," he said. "I figured it's the least I could do." Margaret nodded slowly, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach remained. She wasn't done looking for answers. And she would find them. The whisper of doubt. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She lay awake, listening to the soft rhythm of Walter's breathing beside her, his warmth familiar and steady. 60 years of marriage had given her a deep understanding of his patterns, how he snored lightly when he was exhausted, how he shifted onto his left side when he had something on his mind, and how his breathing slowed just before he drifted into deep sleep. Tonight, he slept soundly. Peacefully. As if nothing were amiss. Margaret, however, couldn't silence the whispers of doubt creeping into her mind. She told herself she was being foolish. That Walter had always been kind, always helped others. This was just another instance of his selflessness. But no matter how many times she repeated this logic in her head, something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the shoveling. It was the way he seemed eager to go outside the moment snow started falling. The way he lingered in Alice's driveway longer than necessary. The way his eyes had flickered, just for a split second, when she had questioned him at the kitchen table. Margaret turned onto her side, staring at the soft glow of the moon filtering through their bedroom window. For the first time in their long marriage, she felt something unfamiliar. Suspicion. The next morning, Walter was up early, as usual. He moved through the kitchen with his typical routine, starting the coffee maker, humming an old tune under his breath as he toasted a slice of bread. Margaret remained in bed longer than usual, feigning sleep as she listened to him move about the house. She wanted to observe him today, without him realizing she was watching. When she finally emerged, wrapped in her thick robe, Walter was already dressed in his winter coat, slipping on his gloves by the front door. Heading out early, she asked casually, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah," Walter said with a cheerful smile. "Storm left a good bit of snow. Better get a start on it before it ices over." Margaret only nodded, watching as he opened the door and stepped outside. Through the window, she saw him pick up his shovel and begin clearing their walkway with his usual determination. She stood there, watching. Waiting. Sure enough, the moment their walkway was done, he crossed the street. Straight to Alice's house. Margaret tightened her grip around her mug. It was one thing to be kind. It was another to make someone else's home a priority over their own. Something was wrong. And she was going to find out what. Digging deeper. The day passed slowly, her mind occupied with 1,000 thoughts. By afternoon, she decided she needed more than just observations. She needed proof. Answers. Margaret wasn't proud of what she was about to do. In 60 years of marriage, she had never invaded Walter's privacy. She had never felt the need to. But now? She walked into their bedroom, heart pounding slightly, and pulled open Walter's closet. Everything was as it had always been, his neatly folded sweaters, his worn but well-kept dress shoes, the jackets he rotated through depending on the season. She exhaled slowly, running her fingers along the fabric of his winter coat. She hesitated, then reached into the pockets. Loose change. A crumpled grocery receipt. A peppermint candy. Nothing suspicious. Margaret let out a small breath, feeling both relieved and foolish. Maybe she really was imagining things. But just as she was about to close the closet door, something caught her eye. At the very back, behind his suits, there was a small box. It was tucked away, almost hidden. A simple wooden box with a brass latch. Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to be the kind of wife who snooped. But something inside her whispered that she needed to look. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it out and set it on the bed. She flipped the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, she found something she hadn't expected. Letters. Dozens of them, some yellowed with age, others newer. All neatly folded and carefully preserved. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Who were they from? She picked up the one on top and slowly unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. Walter, I don't know how to thank you. Your kindness means more than I can ever say. You have been there for me when no one else has, and I will never forget it. With gratitude, Alice. Margaret felt her chest tighten. What kindness? What was Alice thanking him for? She reached for another letter, older this time. Dear Walter. I don't know how I can ever repay you. I would have lost everything if it weren't for you. You saved me. Forever grateful. A. Margaret's fingers trembled. She reached for another, and another. Each letter carried a similar message, gratitude, deep appreciation, and hints at something Margaret didn't understand. Saved her from what? What had Walter done for Alice that she hadn't known about? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Walter had never mentioned anything about Alice needing help. He had never hinted at anything serious. Yet, these letters painted a picture of a deep connection, one Margaret had never been aware of. Her stomach twisted. She had loved Walter for 60 years. Trusted him. But right now, she realized something painful. There were things he had never told her. And she had to find out why. Secrets in the snow. Margaret sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the old letters. The words blurred together as a mix of emotions swirled inside her, confusion, unease, and a quiet, gnawing fear that she wasn't ready to name. She had spent 60 years by Walter's side, believing she knew every facet of him. But now? Now she wasn't so sure. She carefully folded the letters and placed them back inside the wooden box, her fingers lingering on the lid before shutting it. A part of her wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Walter had helped Alice financially. Maybe she had been in a tough spot, and he, being the kind-hearted man he was, had stepped in. But if that were the case, why hadn't he told her? Why keep it a secret? Margaret took a deep breath and pushed herself off the bed, gripping the edge of the dresser for support. Her knees felt weak beneath her as if the foundation of her marriage had suddenly turned unsteady. She needed to talk to him. No more guessing. No more assumptions. She would confront Walter and demand the truth. But first, she needed to see Alice. A visit next door. The thought made her hesitate. She and Alice weren't particularly close. They exchanged pleasantries, small talk about the weather, a comment about the roses Margaret grew in the spring, but nothing beyond that. Would Alice even tell her the truth? Margaret slipped on her thick coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck before stepping outside. The crisp air stung her cheeks as she crossed the street. The snow had already begun to melt under the weak afternoon sun, revealing patches of slick pavement beneath. She walked up the steps of Alice's porch, hesitated for a brief moment, then knocked firmly on the door. A few moments passed before she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps inside. The door creaked open, and Alice appeared, her hazel eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Margaret," she said, smoothing her hands over her apron. What a surprise. Margaret offered a polite smile, though her heart was hammering. "I was wondering if I could have a word with you." Alice hesitated before stepping aside. "Of course. Come in." Margaret stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the warmth of the house. The scent of cinnamon and apples lingered in the air, and a kettle whistled softly from the kitchen. Alice gestured to the living room. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret shook her head. "No, thank you. I won't take up too much of your time." Alice gave a small nod and sat across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Margaret studied the woman in front of her, her face, though kind, bore the lines of hardship. She had lost her husband nearly 10 years ago and had lived alone ever since. Margaret took a deep breath. "Alice, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." Alice's brow furrowed. "Of course. It's about Walter." Alice stiffened ever so slightly. Margaret didn't miss it. "I know he's been helping you," Margaret continued, choosing her words carefully. "Shoveling your walkway, running errands. And I recently found letters. Letters you wrote to him." Alice's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Margaret leaned forward. "I need to know what's going on. Has he been keeping something from me?" A heavy silence settled between them. Alice looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. Finally, she exhaled softly. "Margaret, I never wanted to come between you two." The words sent a chill through Margaret's spine. "Come between us," she echoed. Alice shook her head. "It's not what you think. Walter isn't having an affair, if that's what you're worried about." Margaret's breath left her in a rush, but the relief was short-lived. "Then what is it?" Alice hesitated, then stood abruptly. "Wait here," she said before disappearing down the hall. Margaret sat there, her heart pounding in her ears. Minutes later, Alice returned, holding a worn envelope. She handed it to Margaret with a somber expression. "Read it," she said softly. Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words hit her like a punch to the chest. "A forgotten debt. Dear Walter. I don't know how to properly thank you. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to me and my son. You saved us when no one else would, and I will never forget that. You never asked for anything in return, but I can never repay what you did. I will never forget the kindness you showed me that winter. You gave me my life back. Forever grateful. Beatrice." Margaret's eyes widened. Beatrice. Her breath caught in her throat. Beatrice had been Alice's older sister. She had passed away nearly 30 years ago in a tragic accident. Margaret looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand." Alice sighed. "My sister, she had fallen into a dark place. She was struggling, financially and emotionally. Walter was the only one who helped her. He didn't tell anyone, not even you, because Beatrice made him promise not to. She was too proud, too ashamed. But Walter kept her afloat. He paid for her rent when she lost her job, bought groceries when she couldn't afford them. He saved her life more times than I can count." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. She had no idea. Alice swallowed hard. When Beatrice passed, Walter took it hard. He felt like he hadn't done enough. So when I moved back here, when I found myself struggling in my own way, he stepped in again. He never said it outright, but I think he saw it as a way to make up for the past. To do what he couldn't do for her. Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. Walter. Her Walter. Always carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Always giving, always helping, even when no one asked him to. And he had never said a word. Margaret clutched the letter tightly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "He never told me," she whispered. Alice's expression softened. "Because he never wanted credit. He just wanted to do the right thing." Margaret closed her eyes for a long moment, exhaling shakily. The doubt, the suspicion, it all faded away, replaced by something much deeper. Love. Love for the man she had married, the man who had spent a lifetime quietly carrying the burdens of others without seeking recognition. She needed to go home. She needed to tell Walter that she knew. And that she had never loved him more than she did in this moment. A love measured in silence. Margaret clutched the letter against her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. The truth unraveled before her like an old, delicate thread, one she had never even thought to pull. Walter had never been a man of many words, but his actions had always spoken volumes. And now, Margaret saw them all differently. Every quiet moment, every late-night trip to the grocery store, every time he left the house with an excuse on his lips. He hadn't been hiding infidelity. He had been carrying a debt of the heart, repaying a kindness he believed he still owed to a woman long gone. A woman Margaret had never even known he had helped. She pushed herself off Alice's couch, her body feeling heavier than before. "I need to go home," she murmured. Alice gave a small nod, her eyes full of understanding. Margaret stepped back out into the cold, the wind biting against her skin, but she barely felt it. The short walk home felt like miles. Each step was weighed down by the years she had spent in ignorance, the love she had received without ever questioning where it stemmed from. Walter had never sought praise. He had never demanded recognition. And in her heart, Margaret knew, if she hadn't found those letters, he would have taken this secret to his grave. Facing the truth. The door creaked as Margaret stepped into the house. She could hear the steady scrape of a snow shovel from outside the window. Walter, still out there, clearing the sidewalk as he always did. She took off her coat and scarf, but instead of setting them on the rack, she held on to them. She needed to be out there with him. Stepping back outside, she braced against the cold and walked toward the driveway, where Walter was pushing the last of the snow into a neat pile. He didn't hear her approach, not until she spoke. "You never told me." Walter stopped, his grip tightening around the handle of the shovel. Slowly, he turned to face her, his breath curling in the winter air. "Told you what?" His voice was steady, but she saw the flicker in his eyes. Margaret lifted the letter. His expression didn't change. He didn't look shocked or caught off guard. He simply exhaled, long and slow, as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "You found them," he murmured. "I did," Margaret said softly. "And now I understand." Walter rested his weight against the shovel. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a tired smile, he gestured to the freshly cleared sidewalk. "You know, the first time I ever shoveled snow for Beatrice, she yelled at me." Margaret blinked. "What?" Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "She was so proud. Didn't want charity. Said she could handle herself just fine." He sighed. "But I could see it in her eyes. She was exhausted. She was barely holding it together. I didn't listen to her. I kept doing it anyway." Margaret stared at him, watching the way his hands flexed over the handle of the shovel, the way his shoulders sagged just slightly, tired, worn, but still standing strong. "I never knew," she whispered. Walter's gaze met hers, filled with something unspoken. "I didn't do it for people to know." Margaret swallowed hard, stepping closer. "You carried this alone for so long." Walter shrugged, but there was a heaviness in his movement. "It wasn't a burden," he said simply. "It was a choice." Margaret reached for his gloved hands, wrapping her fingers over his. A choice. That was what love had always been, wasn't it? Not the grand gestures. Not the words spoken in candlelight. But the quiet, unseen sacrifices. The things done without asking. The debts repaid not with money, but with kindness. "I wish you had told me," she murmured. Walter smiled, squeezing her hand. Would it have changed anything? Margaret thought about it. Would it have? Would she have understood back then, in the midst of raising their own family, in the whirlwind of life? Or would she have told him to stop, to put their family first, not realizing that this was Walter's way of showing love? She didn't know. But what she did know was that she loved him more in this moment than she ever had before. A new beginning. That night, as they lay in bed, Margaret turned to Walter in the darkness. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked softly. Walter didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, "Not a day goes by that I don't." Margaret reached for his hand beneath the blankets. "Tell me about her." Walter turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" She nodded. For 60 years, Walter had loved in silence. Now, Margaret was ready to listen. The weight of unspoken love. Margaret lay awake long after Walter's breathing had settled into a slow, steady rhythm beside her. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of old wood settling against the winter chill. The letter still lay on the nightstand, the edges slightly crumpled from where she had gripped it too tightly. Even in the dim glow of the street lamp outside, she could make out Walter's careful handwriting, the ink slightly faded with age. For 60 years, she had loved this man. And yet, she was only now beginning to understand the depth of him. Margaret turned onto her side, watching Walter in the darkness. His face, softened by sleep, held the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him all those years ago. His hands, calloused and rough, had built their life together. And with those same hands, he had spent years repaying a debt of kindness, one she hadn't even known existed. She had thought she knew everything about him. She had been wrong. A different kind of love. Morning arrived in a blur of pale gray light and the distant sound of a snowplow rumbling down the street. Margaret moved through the house with a quiet determination. She made coffee as she always did, but something felt different today. Walter shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He stopped short when he saw her sitting at the table, the letter in front of her. She met his gaze. "Sit with me." Walter hesitated, then slowly pulled out the chair across from her. His eyes flicked to the letter but didn't linger. "You want to talk about it?" he asked quietly. Margaret took a slow breath. "I want to understand." Walter ran a hand over his face. "I already told you." "I know why you did it," she interrupted. "I know what kind of man you are, Walter. But what I don't know is how it felt. To carry this for so long. To love me, to build a life with me, while still carrying a piece of your past." Walter's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might brush it off. But then, something in his face softened. "You really want to know?" Margaret nodded. Walter exhaled, leaning back in his chair. His gaze drifted to the window, where a thin layer of frost clung to the glass. "I met Beatrice before I met you," he began. "I was young. Stupid. Thought I knew everything about life. She was." He paused, searching for the right words. "She was a dreamer. Always had big ideas, always talked about the future like it was a place she was already living in." Margaret stayed silent, letting him speak. "We weren't in love," Walter admitted. "Not the way you and I are. But we were close. She was my best friend. And when her husband left," he stopped, shaking his head. "She never let anyone see how much it broke her." Margaret swallowed hard. Walter continued, his voice quieter now. "She never asked me for anything. Not once. She was proud like that. But I could see it. The way she struggled. The way she worked herself to the bone just to keep going." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I started shoveling her sidewalk that first winter, just like I do now. And every time, she'd open that damn door and tell me to stop. Said she didn't need my help." "But you didn't listen," Margaret murmured. Walter smiled faintly. "No. I didn't. The promise that never left." He rubbed his hands together, lost in thought. "When she got sick, she hid it from everyone. Kept working, kept pretending. By the time she finally told me, it was too late. She had 2 little boys, Margaret. Just babies. And she was terrified of what would happen to them. Margaret's throat tightened. I promised her, Walter said simply. I promised I'd look out for them. His voice grew rough. But I failed her. Margaret's breath caught. Walter. I tried to help, he said, shaking his head. I tried to do everything I could, but there wasn't enough time. And after she was gone, I lost track of them. The boys. They got taken in by family out of state. I never saw them again. He closed his eyes, as if trying to push back the weight of that memory. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his. You didn't fail her, she said softly. Walter let out a shaky breath. I just wanted to keep that promise. In whatever way I could. Margaret understood now. It had never been about repaying a debt. It had been about love. A different kind of love, one not measured in words, but in actions. In shoveling a neighbor's sidewalk. In small, unseen kindnesses. In honoring a promise long after the person it was made to was gone. Carrying it together. Margaret tightened her grip on his hand. You don't have to do it alone anymore, she said. Walter looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Margaret stood, pulling her coat from the chair. Walter frowned. Where are you going? She smiled softly. To shovel the sidewalk with my husband. For the first time in 60 years, Walter let her share the weight of his unspoken love. And for the first time, Margaret truly understood the man she had married. The legacy of kindness. The wind howled softly outside as Margaret and Walter bundled up, layering against the bitter cold. Their gloves, thick with years of wear, fit snugly over their weathered hands. Outside, the early morning light bathed the street in a soft, golden glow, making the freshly fallen snow shimmer like tiny diamonds. Walter had been shoveling these sidewalks alone for decades, carrying the weight of his past with every scrape of metal against ice. But today, for the first time, he wasn't alone. Margaret tightened her scarf, gripping the wooden handle of the extra shovel they kept in the garage. Walter turned to her, a skeptical look on his face. You don't have to do this, you know. She arched a brow. You've been saying that for 60 years, and I haven't listened yet. A slow, amused smile tugged at the corners of Walter's mouth. Margaret planted her feet in the snow, gripping the shovel's handle. Besides, she said, glancing toward Sherry's house, if you're doing this to honor a promise, then I think it's only fair I help keep it too. Walter hesitated. His wife had always been strong, stronger than he sometimes gave her credit for. But this was different. This was his burden. His quiet devotion. And yet, as he looked at Margaret standing beside him, a determined fire in her eyes, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't his burden alone anymore. Maybe it never had been. A new beginning in the snow. The first scrape of Margaret's shovel against the sidewalk echoed in the quiet morning air. Walter watched for a moment, then sighed and joined her, his own shovel carving a path through the thick white layer. They worked side by side, the rhythmic push and lift of snow becoming a silent conversation between them. A few houses down, a curtain shifted slightly. Sherry, the young mother, peeked out from her living room window, her two children pressed against the glass beside her. She had grown used to Walter's quiet acts of kindness, but seeing Margaret there beside him was new. Unexpected. The door creaked open, and she stepped onto the porch, pulling her robe tightly around herself. Mr. Stevens. Mrs. Stevens. Margaret and Walter both paused, turning to look at her. Sherry hesitated before stepping barefoot into the snow, shivering as she rushed toward them. You don't have to do this, really. I was going to get to it later. Walter wiped his brow, smiling kindly. That's what the last one said too. Sherry frowned. The last one? Margaret touched Walter's arm gently, then turned to Sherry. A long time ago, someone once told him the same thing. He never listened then either. Sherry glanced between them, sensing something deeper in Margaret's words. Before she could respond, her son, no older than 8, came tumbling out the door in his pajamas, his boots mismatched on the wrong feet. "Mom! Can I help?" Sherry laughed, shaking her head. "Sweetheart, you don't even have gloves on." Walter chuckled. "That's all right. I think I have an extra pair somewhere." He glanced at Margaret. "Unless you put them in one of your safe places again?" Margaret smirked. "They're in the hall closet, right where they belong." Sherry watched as Walter headed back inside to find the gloves, leaving her alone with Margaret. "You know," Margaret said softly, watching the snow fall in slow, delicate flakes, "Walter isn't just shoveling your sidewalk. He's keeping a promise." Sherry tilted her head. "What kind of promise?" Margaret smiled. "One made long before you ever moved here. One that never faded, even after time tried to bury it." Sherry's eyes softened, sensing the weight of something unspoken. Margaret turned to her, her expression warm. "But I think today, we start making new promises too." A chain reaction of kindness. By the time Walter returned with an extra pair of gloves, Sherry's son had already grabbed a small plastic shovel from the porch and was attempting to scoop snow onto the pile they had made. "You've got some competition," Margaret teased. Walter knelt beside the boy, adjusting his gloves. "I could always use another set of hands." Sherry stepped forward. "Then I suppose I should help too." Margaret grinned. Now it's a proper team. For the next hour, they worked together, clearing the sidewalk not just in front of Sherry's house, but down the entire street. One by one, neighbors peeked out, some offering warm drinks, others grabbing their own shovels to join in. Soon, the block was buzzing with quiet laughter and conversation, the cold forgotten in the warmth of community. Walter, standing beside Margaret, watched as a group of teenagers helped an elderly woman clear the snow from her porch. Across the street, a father guided his young daughter, showing her how to use a snow shovel properly. Margaret nudged Walter's arm gently. "See? You didn't just keep a promise." Walter turned to her. "You started something bigger than yourself. The past, the present, and the future." That evening, as the snow continued to fall in a slow, peaceful drift, Margaret found herself back in their bedroom, standing in front of the closet. She had spent her life holding on to things that carried memories, photographs, old letters, little trinkets from moments that had mattered. Walter had done the same. Only, instead of storing them away in a box, he had lived them. Every winter, every storm, every heavy snowfall, he had carried those memories with every scrape of the shovel. And yet, as she looked at the empty closet shelf where she had found the old letter, she realized something. Walter had spent his whole life keeping a promise to someone who wasn't here anymore. And now, she wanted to spend the rest of their lives making new promises, together. Taking the old letter carefully in her hands, she walked to Walter's side of the bed. He was already there, reading an old book, his reading glasses slipping slightly down his nose. Margaret sat down beside him, placing the letter in his lap. Walter frowned. "What's this?" Margaret smiled softly. "I think it's time you let go." Walter was silent for a long moment. Then, carefully, he folded the letter one last time and placed it in the small wooden box on his nightstand. He ran his hand over the lid, as if sealing away not just paper, but the years of quiet grief he had carried with it. Then he turned to Margaret, taking her hand in his. "Thank you." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "For what?" "For understanding." They sat in silence for a long time, the warmth of the house wrapping around them like a soft embrace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time in decades, Walter Stevens didn't feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Instead, he felt light. Because some promises never die. And others? They're meant to be carried forward, together.